people as of now. We expect more people to join in. So today we have chosen a topic, autoimmune hepatitis. I think this is a topic which is of great interest, both from clinical perspective as well as from the examination point of view. This comes as a differential diagnosis of a lot of liver diseases. And so you need to know about it. I still feel that we are underdiagnosing autoimmune hepatitis. We are missing some of them because they are not being investigated. And often some of these are classified as cryptogenic cirrhosis. So I think we need to know a little bit about it from all perspective. And I think we have a great orator, Dr. Manav Vadhavan, who is from BLK Super Specialty Hospital, hugely experienced in the field of liver disease. And as you will see him, he is a great orator as well. So I would now invite Manav to start the deliberation. Manav.
Thank you, sir, for a very generous introduction. Now, actually, I'm very thankful for you to asking me to talk on this topic. Autoimmune hepatitis, as you said, it's an underdiagnosed disease. It's much more common than what we diagnose it to be. Reasons are manifold. I'll cover that through this presentation. Before I start my presentation, let me tell the residents that the idea of this presentation is to make autoimmune hepatitis simple for them. Simple to understand, simple to diagnose, and even simpler to treat. What I'll try to do is, I'll try to talk about a few things which you will not read in your messenger or any other textbook which you go through. And I'll just try to give you a perspective of how to think about autoimmune hepatitis and how to approach it. So, the conventional wisdom about autoimmune hepatitis was it predominantly affects young white women with generally these ladies have positive autoimmune markers, and if you do a biopsy, you see interphase hepatitis on liver biopsy. That's how the classical description used to be. But the concept has completely undergone a sea change now. It is seen in both genders, although the ratio is 4:1, female versus male. It is seen at all ages. It's not just children or young adults or old age. It is seen across all ages and in every ethnic group. You look at your own hospital data, you look at number of autoimmune hepatitis you diagnose, it is tremendous. The burden of disease is quite significant as compared to what we used to originally believe. We always used to think that conventional serological markers like autoimmune ANA will rule in a disease and absence of ANA will rule out a disease. It's absolutely untrue, as we'll see as we proceed through the presentation. ANA is a very, I would say, itchy marker. And now you are starting to see more and more atypical histological features in these patients also. So with that background, I would start to say that the moment you see any acute or chronic hepatitis in either a male or a female, which includes even patients who have graft dysfunction after liver transplant, you must think of autoimmune hepatitis also. Of course, you go through the run-of-the-mill thing. You rule out viral hepatitis. You ask a drug history. But once you rule out viral hepatitis, autoimmune hepatitis should be on the back of the mind, irrespective of the age group or the ethnicity you're talking about. If you look at clinical presentation of autoimmune hepatitis, there are three predominant clinical presentations. Most of these patients, almost half of them, will present as chronic hepatitis. So incidentally, you'll see raised liver enzymes in the range of 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. They may or may not have fibrosis. The bilirubin may or may not be raised. And when you investigate, you find out that they have autoimmune hepatitis. Almost 1/3 of them present as acute hepatitis, and of which 10% present as acute liver failure. So it is a very important differential when you're looking at ALF also. If you don't find any etiological markers in acute liver failure, if the hepatitis A, E, B's are negative, if there is no drug history, please think of autoimmune hepatitis, especially so. Why? Because steroids can cure autoimmune-induced acute liver failure in almost 50% of cases. Although I'm not discussing ALF today, or autoimmune causing ALF today, but I thought I'll bring it to your notice that 10% of all patients of acute hepatitis presentation may actually have underlying autoimmune hepatitis. And 10 to 15% come to you with complications of portal hypertension, like ascites, like GI bleed. If you go on to investigate all chronic autoimmune hepatitis, almost 1/3 of them, they have cirrhosis at presentation. They'll have either imaging evidence or they have varices on endoscopy. So cirrhosis is quite common at the time of presentation, although you diagnose them clinically as chronic autoimmune hepatitis. Let's come to pathophysiology. There are a few basic concepts which I want you to remember, just 4 or 5 concepts. First, autoimmune hepatitis is a T cell mediated disease. We always talk about autoantibodies, ANAs, AMAs, and asthmas, but they are after effect. I'll discuss that subsequently in my presentation. But please remember, autoimmune hepatitis is a T cell mediated disease. The CD4 cells, specifically CD4 T helper cells, which we talk about, which are MHC2 restricted, they diagnose the self antigen and mount an immune response against it. So that is how autoimmune hepatitis comes into war. So it is a T cell mediated disease. If you look at naive T cells, there are 4 ways a T cell can differentiate. A CD4 T cell, a T helper cell can differentiate as a Th17 response, a Th1 response, Th2 response, and Tregs. Tregs are involved in immune tolerance. Th2 is generally allergies and asthmas. Th17 is the one which leads to autoimmunity. So again, you need to remember a T cell mediated disease. T cell CD4 T helper cells lead to this disease, and it is a Th17 differentiation of CD4 cells which causes the disease. Second concept, it happens in individuals who are predisposed to it. So there are specific HLA patterns. There are some DR3, DR4 polymorphisms which predispose to autoimmune hepatitis. So somebody already has that genetic predisposition and goes on to develop autoimmune hepatitis. CD152 polymorphism, CTLA4 polymorphism have been shown to predispose to autoimmune hepatitis. That is concept number 2. So T cell mediated disease happens in an individual which is predisposed to it. Third concept is there is usually an environmental trigger. Now I want you to understand this concept of molecular mimicry and epitope spreading in slight detail. I'll talk about it in 2 or 3 slides. So there is a guy who is predisposed to develop autoimmune disease. There is an environmental trigger. That environmental trigger may be a viral infection. It may be a xenobiotic use. It may be some drug which may trigger the autoimmunity. Now, the microbial peptides, let's say a virus is triggering this. The viral antigen may have a sequence which is similar to autoantigenic peptides, leads to antibody response, and that antibody response then starts acting against the self antigen, which is hepatocytes in this case. That's called molecular mimicry. But the concept of molecular mimicry is too simplistic. Many a time what happens is you cannot really point out environmental influence, environmental trigger which has led to autoimmune hepatitis. Why that happens? That is explained by the concept of epitope spreading. So what happens is the environmental trigger happens maybe weeks to months to years before the triggering of autoimmunity, and it is the epitope spreading which explains that concept. What is epitope spread? What is an epitope? Epitope is an antigen that is recognized by immune system, specifically by forming antibodies. So the antibody which human body forms against the environmental antigen, that is a virus, will basically, it is formed to destroy that antigen. Now that antigen houses inside a hepatocyte, let's say, and the antibody adapts itself over a period of weeks to months to years. The epitope keeps on changing. The initial antigen which led to the antibody response may subsequently disappear. So by the time the autoimmunity is launched, the autoimmunity is triggered, the original antigen which has led to it has disappeared. That's the reason you never find an environmental antigen in these patients. But the autoimmunity is triggered. So for those who are interested, this is a separate topic in itself. If I start talking about molecular mimicry and epitope spreading, it's I would say 40-minute talk in itself. But you must understand this, must read about it. You can go back and search your literature and take a talk to understand this. The other way how the immunity is triggered, autoimmunity is triggered, is by forming new antigens. Now, self antigens may be modified by either drugs or microorganisms. So here it is not molecular mimicry. It is the antigen which is a self antigen which is changed somehow, maybe by forming adducts, maybe by adding something to it by a microorganism or by various drugs. And that becomes a autoantigen. And that leads to triggering of autoimmunity. So that's the fourth concept. T cell mediated disease, Th17 differentiation, molecular mimicry, and neoantigens. These are the causes of sorry. These are how autoimmunity is triggered. And what we talk about, the subsequent autoantibody formation, that is the after effect of triggering of autoimmunity. So autoantibodies are formed after autoimmunity has been triggered. That's what we need to understand. That's the other concept. So cytokines which are secreted from CD4 T cells will lead to recruitment of CD8 T cells, will also lead to recruitment of B cells and plasma cells, which then form autoantibodies. So autoantibodies will appear later in the course of disease. So many a times autoimmunity has been triggered and ANA is not positive. You have autoimmune hepatitis, anti-nuclear antigen is missing, asthma is missing, because autoantibodies are effect, not the cause of autoimmunity. That's the other concept which we need to remember. Whether these autoantibodies are at all pathogenic, even that is debatable. There are various studies which say that autoantibodies are not pathogenic at all. There are others which say that they may contribute to pathogenicity. But one thing is true, autoantibodies are formed later in autoimmunity. That is how you explain autoimmune-induced acute liver failure has ANA negative in almost 2/3 of patients. The more acute the disease, the more likely is the autoantibody to be absent in these cases. So that's what I wanted you to remember in the pathophysiology part. If I have to summarize the pathophysiology, these are 5 points which I want you to remember. Autoimmune hepatitis is a T-cell mediated disease. T helper cells, specifically the Th17 and Th1 differentiation of T helper cells, which causes the disease. Those individuals who are genetically predisposed to develop autoimmune hepatitis develop it. There are environmental triggers, which in the form of molecular mimicry and epitope spreading incite the autoimmune response. The cytokines which are secreted by CD4 T cells amplify the liver injury by recruiting the other immune cells like CD8 T cells, like B cells, like NK cells, natural killer cells. And autoantibodies, they help in diagnosis, but they are not, may or may not be pathogenic. So this is all the 5 points which you want to remember in pathophysiology of autoimmune hepatitis. Let's move on to the part 2 of presentation. How do you diagnose autoimmune hepatitis? Now, this is something which is of clinical importance in day-to-day practice. So please bear with me when I run through this. Clinically, you have 3 types of autoimmune hepatitis. Type 1 is a classical one which we see in adults. Patients are usually ANA with asthma positive. It may happen in all age groups. It is the most common type. Almost 2/3 of patients have type 1 autoimmune hepatitis, and also it has the best treatment response. Type 2 autoimmune hepatitis, you have ANA asthma, which may or may not be positive, but anti-LKM is positive in these cases. It happens more often in children, and it is a more aggressive disease. This is more difficult to treat. Treatment failures are common. I'll talk about treatment failures subsequently, but here you need to understand that treatment failures are more common in juvenile onset autoimmune hepatitis. And then you have autoimmune hepatitis type 3. Many people actually believe that autoimmune hepatitis type 3 is a part and parcel of type 1 only, because the age groups it affects is mostly adults. Most of them are ANA asthma positive, and they also have soluble liver antigen LP antibody. Sorry, most of them are ANA negative, but they have soluble liver antigen and liver protein antigen positive. This has a high relapse rate, this form of autoimmune hepatitis, but the response is good on treatment. Once you stop treatment, the relapse rate is much higher as compared to other autoimmune hepatitis. We also need to remember overlap syndromes. So every patient whom you diagnose as autoimmune hepatitis, you have to get their anti-mitochondrial antibody also done, because autoimmune hepatitis PBC overlap is the most common overlap. Now I am only listing the overlap syndromes here. I'm not going to talk about overlap syndrome because again, this is a separate topic by itself. So you have autoimmune PBC overlap. You may have autoimmune PSC overlap. You have predominant PBC with autoimmune overlap. All these can only be diagnosed with liver biopsy, and autoimmune markers may give you a picture. What serological markers we do? The commonest one is ANA. It is positive in 80% of autoimmune hepatitis. So again, let me remind you this, what I said, what told you previously. Many autoimmune hepatitis may be ANA negative. So ANA positivity does not diagnose autoimmune hepatitis. ANA negativity does not rule out autoimmune hepatitis. There will be many cases where you have hepatitis B and hepatitis C as a cause of liver disease, and the patient may have ANA positivity. Hence comes the role of liver biopsy, which again I'm going to discuss subsequently. Anti-SMA. This is a antibody against filamentous actin. It is seen in 60% of autoimmune hepatitis and usually goes with ANA positivity. So again, another important clinical thing to remember, if you have ANA negative, ASMA positive, it is not considered significant. So positivity of SMA is significant only if you have a ANA patient, ANA positivity also. So ANA, asthma always go together. Anti-LKM, I told you, is uncommon in adults. It is seen in pediatric autoimmune hepatitis, and it has a low sensitivity but high specificity. As I told you, pediatric onset autoimmune hepatitis is a worse disease. It has high treatment failure rate and high relapse rate once you stop treatment. The other antibodies are multiple, but I want you to remember two antibodies, which you often do if you have ANA and asthma negativity. One is soluble liver antigen, anti-SLA antibody. Now, this antibody is important. Why? Because it is associated with severity. It also predicts the response to therapy. And it is very useful in diagnosing seronegative disease. Remember, type 3 autoimmune hepatitis, where ANA and asthma are negative, you have soluble liver antigen antibody positive in these cases. The other antibody, which is very important to remember, is anti-liver cytosol type 1, anti-LC1 antibody. This is also useful in diagnosing seronegative disease. So if you suspect autoimmune hepatitis, your ANA and asthma and LKM are negative. The two antibodies which you do are anti-LC1 antibody and anti-SLA antibody. The diagnosis of autoimmune hepatitis, clinical suspicion. You have viral markers negative. There is no significant drug history to be in that patient. You do all the autoimmune markers, including serum IgG. So serum IgG levels have equal importance to gamma globulin. And this is the traditional scoring chart on the basis of which you diagnose autoimmune hepatitis. The important things are the liver function test, IgG levels above normal, autoimmune marker, which I've already talked about. Here, AMA is done. So if you have an AMA positivity, it is against a diagnosis of a primary autoimmune, but you still may have a AIH-PBC overlap. Obviously, viral markers are supposed to be negative in these cases. There should not be any drug history. Alcohol history should not be significant. So these are the clinical biochemical markers which you do in patients of autoimmune hepatitis to diagnose it. Over a period of time, this was originally proposed in 1999, but over a period of years, it was realized that it is too complicated a chart for diagnosing autoimmune hepatitis, and then hence came in what we now know as simplified diagnostic scoring system. This basically talks about only 4 things here. So instead of all the markers which we talked about in the previous chart, you only look at 4 things. You look at autoantibodies, again, ANA or SMA, maybe LKM or anti-SLA, which I've talked about. You look at immunoglobulin levels, liver biopsy. So in each diagnosis of autoimmune hepatitis, liver biopsy is mandatory. And obviously viral markers have to be negative in these patients, and you diagnose based on this diagnostic scoring system. This is a simplified diagnostic scoring system. The only caveat of this system is when you're talking about autoimmune induced acute liver failure, then it is not relevant. Then you have to go back to the original scoring system. Why? The reason is, as I told you, acute autoimmune hepatitis causing acute liver failure often has IgG, which is normal, often has all markers which are negative. Why? Because by the time the disease onset has happened, the autoantibodies have not formed, the IgG is not raised. So you look at the original system to diagnose acute ALF caused by autoimmune hepatitis. There are multiple pitfalls in diagnosis. Again, you need to understand. I have highlighted again and again that ANA is not specific. You may have an ANA positivity in a patient who has viral hepatitis. You may have an ANA negativity in patient who has autoimmune hepatitis. So ANA alone may not be a sensitive or specific marker. Gamma globulinemia, you see in almost all patients who have cirrhosis. Once you have F3, F4 fibrosis, the gamma globulin start going up. The IgG levels start going up. Hence comes the caveat. Other important thing to remember is in patients who have autoimmune hepatitis and advanced fibrosis, the enzymes may not be very high. The enzyme may be just be in the range of 60, 70, 80. 2 important things. Drug-induced liver injury may closely mimic autoimmune hepatitis even on a biopsy. And there's another entity called drug-induced autoimmune hepatitis to make things more complicated. So all these I'm just highlighting for you to just remember that the diagnosis may not be easy. You need multiple ways. You need all the markers. You need immunoglobulins, and most importantly, you need a liver biopsy to diagnose autoimmune hepatitis. So liver biopsy is mandatory. You should not even think of diagnosing autoimmune hepatitis only on the basis of serological markers and clinical presentation. You have to have a biopsy. You will be surprised to see that a person whom you think is a classical autoimmune with the ANA 1:320 may have a biopsy which may not show autoimmune hepatitis, and vice versa. Somebody who is ANA negative has IgG which is normal, enzymes which are raised, you do a biopsy and that comes out to be classical autoimmune hepatitis. So no diagnosis of autoimmune hepatitis without a liver biopsy. To summarize the second part, the diagnosis based on 4 parameters: autoimmune markers, IgG levels, absence of viral hepatitis and alcohol, and liver biopsy. Most important of these is liver biopsy. So liver biopsy will supplement the diagnosis even when you have all other parameters which are negative. A simplified scoring system is good for diagnosis of autoimmune hepatitis, except in autoimmune hepatitis induced acute liver failure. So that's where I stop in diagnosis. I go on to the third part, which is the final part of my presentation. I will take another 20 minutes or so in this. So once you have diagnosed autoimmune hepatitis, how do you want to treat it? Now this is a table which I have taken from Schlesinger. This is a simple table and gives us almost everything. What are the urgent indications for treatment? A patient who has acute presentation, AST which is more than 10 times upper limit normal, or AST which is more than 5 times upper limit normal, and gamma globulin which are more than 2-fold upper limit normal. And on histology, if you have moderate to severe interface hepatitis or bridging necrosis or multilobular necrosis or central lobular necrosis. In these cases, without waiting, you start treatment with high dose steroids. When I say high dose steroids, I mean 1 milligram per kg body weight steroid. I'll come to that subsequently. Now, non-urgent indications of treatment means you may start with a lower dose of steroid, but they still may need treatment. So even if the AST is 2 times elevated, 3 times elevated, and if the gamma globulins are high, you want to start this guy on treatment. Even a mild interface hepatitis, you may think of treating. But very important to remember is whom not to treat. Now, this is actually equally important as the previous slide. If you have an asymptomatic patient with normal serum AST and normal gamma globulin levels, even if you have a biopsy which is showing autoimmune hepatitis, mild disease, probably you should not be treating. This is the point number 2 is very, very important point. Inactive cirrhosis, a patient who has a decompensated cirrhosis. Even if you diagnose autoimmune hepatitis, don't treat it. Why? The liver reserve is gone. Steroids will further complicate the clinical presentation. It might predispose the patient to more infection. So in an inactive cirrhosis or in a decompensated cirrhosis, treatment is not indicated unless you have a biopsy evidence showing inflammation in the liver. So even mild portal inflammation in inactive cirrhosis should not be treated. Obviously, if you have contraindications to treatment, that means azathioprine and steroids we know are the baseline, the standard of care. The combination therapy is used. So if you have severe cytopenias, as would happen in a decompensated cirrhosis, you don't want to treat that patient with azathioprine. And brittle diabetes, vertebral compression fracture, you don't want to give steroids, but that's a relative thing. But please remember the first 2 ones. Asymptomatic patient with normal AST and normal gamma globulin should not be treated. Inactive cirrhosis, even with mild portal inflammation, should not be treated. Treatment, if you use monotherapy, you start with 1 milligram per kg body weight prednisolone. If you use combination therapy, which I mostly do in almost all the patients, prednisolone with azathioprine is used. Some people would use 50 milligram per day standard dose of azathioprine. Some would use 1 milligram or 1.2 milligram per kg body weight. But please remember one thing again here. If your autoimmune hepatitis patient has jaundice as presentation, we prefer not to start azathioprine straight away. We would start them on prednisolone, would wait for the response, which usually would take 2 to 3 weeks. Once the bilirubin starts falling down, maybe comes in the range of 2 to 3, that's when we add azathioprine. Because many times in jaundice patient, azathioprine toxicity is too much to handle. So that's the only scenario where we would delay azathioprine and start only with prednisolone. In all other cases, a combination of prednisolone and azathioprine should be given. If you have to divide the autoimmune hepatitis treatment, it would be in 2 phases. One is the induction phase, and the second one is the maintenance phase. So when you mean induction phase, you want a rapid response. There are various studies that have been published comparing steroids alone with a combination of steroids and AZA versus AZA alone, and almost all of them have shown that whether you use steroids alone or you use a combination of prednisolone and azathioprine, the response rates in induction are similar. I told you steroids are essential for induction, azathioprine is optional for induction. I would start in almost all patients except in those who have jaundice, and that's what I would want you to remember. The story of the maintenance phase is completely different. It was again some time back we were made to believe that steroids are essential for maintaining maintenance. So steroids are important for maintaining remission in almost all cases, but that's not true. There are 4 randomized controlled trials which have been shown to compare use of prednisolone alone versus prednisolone AZA versus AZA alone. And it is very well known concept that in patients who respond well to a combination therapy, you can taper off steroids. The usual time to taper off steroids in a stable patient is between 1 to 2 years after starting treatment, and azathioprine is continued for a longer period of time. So in maintenance of remission, AZA alone is as good as AZA plus prednisolone. Obviously, prednisolone alone is not a good option, and we should not be using prednisolone to maintain remission without azathioprine. Next question, clinical question which comes to our mind is how long to continue treatment for autoimmune hepatitis? Now, this is something which has less evidence and more of, I would say, personal preference. Let's see, how do you define remission? You define clinical remission as normal AST/ALT, normal bilirubin, and normal IgG levels. Most of these patients will also turn their autoantibodies to negligible levels. So let's say you started with the autoantibody level of 1:320. If the patient is in remission, either the autoantibody may be negative or it may have come down to a titer of 1:40 or 1:20. But again, histological remission is what you aim for. So if you have a normal liver biopsy, you actually can think of stopping all treatment. Mind you, if you look at only remission, as in normal AST, bilirubin, and IgG, almost all patients whom you treat, almost all adults, 80% of the adults whom you treat would achieve remission by their standards in less than 1 year. If you are thinking of stopping treatment, then the minimum duration of treatment is at 2 years in adults and 3 years in children. That means I would repeat a liver biopsy usually after 2 to 3 years in these patients. If the biopsy is normal, then you can think of tapering off the medication over a period of next 6 months to 1 year. Only 1/4 of patients of autoimmune hepatitis will maintain steady remission even after stopping treatment. 75% of these patients will require retreatment. So that is the broad figures in treating autoimmune hepatitis. In those whom you are able to taper off treatment, only 1/4 maintain remission without treatment. Let's talk about difficult to treat population. So how do you define a difficult to treat population? Difficult to treat population, again, you have 3 categories here. One is relapse after stopping therapy. I told you 3/4 of the patients who stop therapy would relapse. One relapse means you should never try and taper therapy again. The patient should be on lifelong therapy with azathioprine. Steroids may or may not be required depending on the severity. As I told you, maintenance AZA alone is good enough. There will be patients who will have incomplete response. That means they will not be able to get back to a normal AST/ALT even after 3 years of therapy. In that case, what you do is you have to give steroids. And you give the steroids at the minimum dose where remission was achieved. So mostly what will happen is you will start them on steroids and azathioprine. 1 year down the line, once you come below the dose of 10 milligram, maybe once you reach 5 milligram, the enzymes will start shooting up. The moment you go back to 10, the enzymes will normalize. So that's where you want to stop. That's where you want to say keep steroids at this dose will be continued because this patient has incomplete response. And of course, you can think about salvage therapy, which I'll talk about subsequently. The other subgroup, a smaller subgroup, is treatment failure. This is more commonly seen in pediatric age group. You'll see once in a while in adults also, where the patient is not responding on treatment. You start treatment and enzymes are continue to worsen. Now that's where you want to be very careful in deciding what you want to do. And that's where the role of seeing whether the patient is responding to azathioprine or not comes into picture. How do you see that? There will be some very fast metabolizers who are not able to achieve the adequate levels of active azathioprine metabolites. And how do you check that? It's a method which is available. You need a good lab for it. I think it's done at All India Institute of Medical Sciences. You may not get many private labs to do it for you, but you can see actually TGN assays and MMPRS concentrations inside the RBC, which tells you whether the azathioprine which you are giving is actually reaching where you want it to reach. This is done by HPLC assays. But you only need to do it for those patients who have primary treatment failure. For all other patients, you don't need it. I thought because we are talking about treatment failure and ASA assays, I must introduce you to metabolism of azathioprine here. Because one of the strategies to increase ASA concentration is to give the inhibitors of pathway of azathioprine. So azathioprine, the active metabolite is 6-mercaptopurine. You also have 6-mercaptopurine available, but it's a more difficult to get drug. 6-mercaptopurine is subsequently metabolized into TIMPs and TXMPs, which are the active metabolites, which are called 6-TGN, thioguanine nucleotides. There are two additional pathways of azathioprine metabolism. The 6-mercaptopurine is metabolized by xanthine oxidase into this inactive compound. So one way to increase the active component is to inhibit xanthine oxidase, which is done by allopurinol. It's a simple drug. You remember allopurinol? It's a xanthine oxidase inhibitor. So if you diagnose that ASA concentrations are not getting achieved, you may add allopurinol to increase the ASA concentrations, and which may help you to get the patient into remission. Now, this is something which I thought I must discuss. We always do TPMT levels before we start azathioprine. Let me go back to the slide which I showed you. What is TPMT? TPMT is the enzyme which is used to metabolize azathioprine. If you have absent TPMT, then the active concentration of the active metabolite, this metabolite, 6-TMPs, is much higher and causes toxicity. See, this is TPMT. 6-mercaptopurine is inactivated by xanthine oxidase to 6-TUA, and TPMT causes this to convert into 6-MMP, which is the toxic metabolite. So if you have TPMT, which is absent, then the toxic metabolite will be much, much higher in these patients. And that's how that's the reason we should do TPMT levels in patients before giving azathioprine tox. And it is a standard recommendation. Now, if you ask me, the deficiency of TPMT in Indian population is very low. That means most of our patients have normal TPMT levels, but because it is in the guidelines that you should do TPMT levels before starting azathioprine, I do it in all my patients. If you ask me, in my last 20-25 years of experience, how many low TPMT levels have I seen? I would say very few, maybe 2 or 3. 99% of Indian population has normal TPMT levels. So you'll get away in 99.9% of patients. But once in a while you get stuck. That's the reason you should do a TPMT level before starting azathioprine. If you are not doing a TPMT level, it may be worthwhile to actually give a lower dose of azathioprine. Let's say you treat autoimmune hepatitis, the patient is not responding, or you're not able to taper steroids below 20 milligram or 15 milligram, and patient starts having side effects of steroids. Then what are the alternative strategies? There are 3 drugs which are available, which have a good response rate. You're all aware of tacrolimus and cyclosporine. These are calcineurin inhibitors, which are used in transplant also. They have a good response. Autoimmune hepatitis, they are used as salvage drugs for autoimmune hepatitis, and they have a reasonably good response. And mycophenolate mofetil also is available. This is again a transplant medication, very often used in liver and kidney transplant. And this also had a good response. Autoimmune hepatitis has a good response rate to mycophenolate mofetil also. Nowadays, there's a lot of talk about budesonide. Now, budesonide is a orally active steroid, which is metabolized in the liver. So you don't have any systemic toxicity. It has been proposed as an alternative to your Visolons and prednisolons. As of now, the current recommendation says that you can use budesonide in patients who are either steroid intolerant You can even try budesonide in low-grade autoimmune hepatitis. You remember the non-urgent indications, patient who had mild portal inflammation but enzyme rise 2 times, gamma globulin maybe 1.5 times. You diagnose that guy to be autoimmune hepatitis, but it's a low-grade activity. There you can replace Visilon with a budesonide. That's where we are currently using it. It is shown to be effective in mild autoimmune hepatitis disease, but in severe disease, obviously it cannot replace prednisolone. I've talked about cyclosporin and tacrolimus. The response rates are quite high, in the range of 90%, even in problematic patients. The problem with these drugs are they are more toxic. They have renal toxicity, they have multiple other effects. They cause hyperlipidemia, they induce hypertension. So that's the reason they are not the first line drugs. They are used as second line drugs in case the treatment with steroids and azathioprine fails. But they are a good option, and even in problem patients, the response rates are more than 90%. So that's the summary slide. You diagnose autoimmune hepatitis as per the criteria. In mild disease without cirrhosis, you start budesonide and azathioprine. If the disease is more severe, moderate to severe, you start with prednisolone and azathioprine. If you have a failed therapy with prednisolone and azathioprine, you go on to tacrolimus or cyclosporin or mycophenolate. All three are equally good, more than 90% response rates as salvage treatment. If you have azathioprine intolerance, you use mycophenolate mofetil. I am going to skip the emerging therapies part because all those who are interested can actually go back and read about the article which has been published around 3 years back. These are all investigational drugs like rituximab and infliximab, but as of now they are not licensed for use, so I'll skip that part because for the sake of simplicity. But these are last two slides which I'm presenting to you. These are very important. Once you diagnose a patient with autoimmune hepatitis and put him on therapy, please do not forget to put the patient on surveillance. Surveillance with bone mineral density, because this guy is getting steroids for a long period of time. You have to supplement vitamin D and calcium in these patients. You have to look at cataracts and glaucomas. Because the patient is on azathioprine, initially you do the blood counts every week for a month, then monthly, and in a longer run, you want to do blood counts every 6 months. You don't want to miss out azathioprine-induced myelotoxicity. The patients may actually die because of that. All these patients are liver disease patients. They are immunosuppressed. They must be vaccinated against hepatitis A and hepatitis B. The other thing which I wanted to remember is tumor surveillance. Although the annual incidence of hepatocellular carcinoma in autoimmune cirrhosis is lesser than other etiologies, but it is still significant to the tune of 2% per year. If you have a long-standing cirrhosis, any patient who has portal hypertension, or a patient who's not responding, has persistent liver inflammation, raised liver enzyme, tumor surveillance should be started and done in these patients as you would do in any other patient of cirrhosis. That's my last slides, my dear friends. Steroids and azathioprine is the standard of care for induction treatment of autoimmune hepatitis. Azathioprine alone is as good as combination with steroids in the maintenance therapy. CNIs, that means calcineurin inhibitors, tacrolimus and cyclosporin, are very effective as salvage therapy. Even mycophenolate mofetil can be used if the patient has no cytopenia, and it's equally effective. I thank you for your patient listening. I think we have almost 10-15 minutes for discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. Manav, thank you. It was a very, very informative talk. I think you went much beyond the textbooks and very, very practical issues which you discussed. There are, as you can see on the chat box, about 10 to 12 questions. So maybe rather than my asking you those questions, if you can look at the chat box and answer some of them. And then if there are more questions cropping up, we can do that. Can you look at the chat box?
Sure. Yeah, I can see that, sir. Let me start with the... Okay. So Anand Gupta is asking, is it possible to have normal globulin level but a high gamma globulin level? See, globulin, gamma globulin, please differentiate between gamma globulin and IgG. IgG is separate, gamma globulin is separate. Now, these combinations are usually not true, but it can happen. So, for record, you may have a normal gamma globulin but high IgG. But usually, they will both be elevated in conjunction. anti-LC1 and SLA positive but ANA negative, which kind of hepatitis is that? Now that's type 3 autoimmune hepatitis. But again, the diagnosis of autoimmune hepatitis is not based on anti-LC1 or SLA positivity, it is based on biopsy. So if you have a biopsy evidence of autoimmune hepatitis and you have anti-LC1 or SLA, it's not and, it's or. So either LC1 or SLA positive and biopsy evidence, you label that as type 3 autoimmune hepatitis. It is generally more severe and it is generally, the relapse rates are higher in these patients. Okay. Acute autoimmune hepatitis, how do we diagnose? The only way to diagnose, so acute autoimmune hepatitis, you're talking about acute hepatitis or acute liver failure. In both cases, the diagnosis is based on biopsy. Now, in acute autoimmune hepatitis, it is not difficult. You can do a biopsy because INRs are normal. Liver biopsy in acute liver failure becomes a major problem. You have to do a transjugular biopsy. The patient is sick. The patient is in encephalopathy. It's often talked about, very less often done. But if you're able to do it and prove it, many patients of autoimmune hepatitis can be salvaged by steroid alone rather than a transplant. Okay, there's a question.
So
Can we
when we are
suspect
at
autoimmune hepatitis?
Manav, is there any role for pulse therapy in this situation?
Sir, it has not been shown to be useful.
Okay. So we still
it's not
provide
been
a
shown to be
standard
useful.
therapy of starting with 60 milligram of or equivalent prednisolone, or is there any role for pulse therapy? There's no role for pulse therapy?
It's not shown to be useful, sir. So 60 milligram of prednisolone or equivalent dose of hydrocortisone or dexamethasone or whichever steroid you want has been shown to be equally effective in these patients. And in fact, you can see the response in 4 to 5 days. Generally, patients who are responding will show you a falling bilirubin over 4-5 days period. So there was a concept of 25% change of bilirubin in these patients, which was promoted, and I think it is still relevant now. On day 5, if the bilirubin has dropped by more than 25%, the patient is probably responding, otherwise not. And pulse therapy, as in 500 milligrams of methylprednisolone, has not been shown to be more useful as compared to a standard dosage.
So, but while we are still at that, as you rightly said, in acute liver failure, it's very difficult to establish a diagnosis. So, are we justified in giving steroids on a little conjecture in this situation? Because we know that these patients are sick and the steroids can sometimes harm. And the added question would be that what will be the criteria for liver transplant in this situation?
Sir, it's a very difficult question to answer. Now, it will be individual choice. If you look at Japanese literature, Japanese give steroid to all patients of acute liver failure, irrespective of etiology. If you look at evidence-based medicine, by giving a 60 milligram prednisolone is not a small dose of steroid, it's a significant dose of steroid. A patient already has acute liver failure. You may actually worsen his condition. As you very rightly said, you may precipitate sepsis in these patients. So I will be wary of giving steroids in these patients without a proper diagnosis. Secondly, indications for transplant. If you get a diagnosis of autoimmune hepatitis, so I actually talked about autoimmune hepatitis-induced acute liver failure almost 2 years back and did some literature research on that. Now, what is sacrosanct is if you have a MELD score which is more than 26, please do not give steroids. Straight away ask for a transplant. This is autoimmune-associated acute liver failure I'm talking about. So a MELD score which is more than 26, more than or equal to 26 is an absolute indication for transplant. A MELD score from 15 to 25, you can start with a steroid trial. You may have almost 50% of patients responding to steroid. Others will need a transplant. But you need to take a decision early regarding transplant. You need to prepare the patient, give a trial, and decide on day 4.
Okay.
So patients with chronic hepatitis with positive autoimmune markers refusing liver biopsy. I don't know how to help them. I will not start steroids with just positive autoimmune markers. I would never do that. Autoimmune hepatitis, decompensated cirrhosis, not willing for transplant, how to manage? Manage like a standard decompensated patient. You should not be using steroids in a decompensated autoimmune cirrhosis. So let me reiterate what I talked to you when not to treat. One is decompensated cirrhosis. No matter what the enzymes are, no matter how acute the inflammation is, you should not be treating these patients with steroids. Second is inactive cirrhosis. Even a child age cirrhosis who has no activity, as in AST is normal, gamma globulins are normal, biopsy does not show significant inflammation, you should not be treating. Because again, the side effect of steroid and azathioprine will be more than the help you can do to these patients. There's a question when to do SLA and LC. SLA and LC are done when you're suspecting autoimmune hepatitis and ANA and asthma are negative. If ANA asthma are positive, you have a biopsy evidence, you don't need soluble liver antigen and liver cytosol antibody. So after ruling out infective cause, can we give empirical steroids? I've already answered that question. I would not give it. Once autoimmune hepatitis develops in cirrhosis, we should not be treating the patient for autoimmune hepatitis, but there are risks of developing malignancy. Should they still be treated even if cirrhosis develops? So I already answered that question. You treat cirrhosis, AIH-associated cirrhosis, if you have significant activity on biopsy. So a child A cirrhosis with biopsy evidence of inflammation should be treated with steroid. A child A cirrhosis without evidence of inflammation should not be treated. A decompensated cirrhosis should not be treated. Because here you're not altering the natural course of disease. What is the cutoff of bilirubin to start azathioprine? Okay, that's important thing. That's an important thing. So if I see a patient of jaundice who has a bilirubin above 5, I will be very wary of starting azathioprine in the beginning. I would give him steroid, look at the response, get the bilirubin to maybe around 2-3 levels, and then add azathioprine. That's what I do. But if you ask me evidence, there is very little. I would ask Dr. Goenka to comment on it. What is your clinical practice in such scenarios?
I missed the last question. Can we repeat the question?
So a student is asking, if you have jaundice, at what levels would you not be comfortable starting AZA? I would not start AZA straight away in a bilirubin above 5. But there is not much clinical evidence to support
that usually 3 to 5 would be the cutoff point, and only below 5 will add AZA. I agree.
Great. Thank you, sir. I cannot see any. I can't move the questions here. Okay, now I can. Do we treat this is an important question. Do we treat drug-induced autoimmune hepatitis by stopping drugs only, or do they need steroids? Now, this is something which is very important, which we all must understand. Once we have diagnosed a drug-induced autoimmune hepatitis, we always start the same way as autoimmune hepatitis. We treat them with azathioprine and steroids. The only difference here is that you can actually try and taper off the medication earlier. In a classical autoimmune hepatitis, you at least wait for 3 years to give a taper. In a drug-induced autoimmune hepatitis, I would taper steroid by the end of 1 year. I may think of tapering azathioprine within 2nd year also. And the total tapering of medication, that means complete taking the patient off medication, is a bit higher. You can almost in 50% of patients, you actually can take them off the medication. But again, the literature is not very evident in this. This is again personal experience. Okay. Liver transplant in acute and chronic liver failure due to autoimmune hepatitis. I have already answered that. A MELD above 26, straight away transplant. Between 15 and 25, you can think of giving steroids as a therapy. But if you have a florid decompensation, as in a patient who has cirrhosis and acute this thing, then this steroid thing is not valid. I'm only talking about autoimmune induced acute liver failure, not ACLS here.
I think a lot of question on NUDT and NUDT 15 and TPMT.
So I generally do only TPMT. I'm not doing NUDT levels at all.
NUDT, is it available
TPMT level, sir? I'm not sure, sir. I'm not sure whether it's available commercially, NUDT. TPMT is available, but NUDT, I'm not sure it's available.
Because when we talk about the IBD and use of azathioprine. There are some studies from, I think, Ludhiana, where they looked at NUDT and they say that in Asian population, that may be more important than doing TPMT. But then I don't know whether this is commercially available or this has been done only as a research purpose.
Even my feeling is it's just a part of research. We don't have, at least I'm not aware, sir. I've never done NUDT in my life. Regarding TPMT, let me again clarify. Indian population TPMT levels are usually wild type, 99.9%. It's only 1 in 1,000 patients who may have a mutation of TPMT. So it may be less relevant, but because the guidelines say, I do it.
But only issue is that we are nowadays in a medical legal era. And then I remember one rare patient who had problems, and then he almost asked me that why you did not do a TPMT assay in me before starting azathioprine. So I think if you look from the medical legal aspects, we may still, somebody who is going to be on a long term, do a TPMT and document that he has a wild type.
Right, sir. I agree with you, sir. That's the reason I also do it. Relapse after transplant in autoimmune hepatitis. Now that's quite common actually. So, sorry, what we have started doing when we are transplanting autoimmune hepatitis, we don't taper steroids. So we will continue a 5 milligrams. Normally, after transplant, we start triple immunosuppression, CNI plus mycophenolate plus steroid. Almost all etiologies, you taper steroid by the end of 6 months. But if autoimmune hepatitis is the primary cause of disease, then we continue steroid for at least 2 years in these patients. And then even after that, give a very slow taper. If they have any enzyme rise, we'll give steroid for lifelong. Management in pregnancy, azathioprine is reasonably safe in pregnancy. If you are using small dose of steroid, they can be given. So I would not change the management of autoimmune hepatitis in pregnant females. A 5 milligram prednisolone, I would continue. Azathioprine, I will continue. So I have no tips for autoimmune with COVID. I'm sorry. So there's a question, autoimmune with COVID, any tips? I have no tips on that. You should ask a COVID expert. Do we treat? Okay, we have answered the drug-induced one. Can you see any more questions here, sir?
I think one question is whether the HIV vaccine is available in India. Yes, it is available in India. And
Of course it is available.
for the COVID, I think the only thing which, while we do not have data, only thing is that possibly keep the immunosuppression as low as possible. We would possibly want to avoid methotrexate and azathioprine after the COVID develops. Maybe temporarily you stop them. That is, we are drawing conclusions from the IBD data. That IBD, they say that methotrexate and other immunosuppression should be avoided and keep the steroid to the lowest possible at that stage.
That makes a lot of sense, sir, because that's the same thing we are using for our transplant patients also. We are stopping the anti-metabolite, mycophenolate, continuing tacrolimus and a small dose steroids. So I think we should do the same for autoimmune hepatitis also. Somebody who is only on azathioprine, probably it may make sense to start a small dose steroid and stop azathioprine.
Yes, agreed. So I think you have answered most of the questions. Now, we often find, Manav, that when you are talking about elderly individuals, you find everything else is negative and ANA is positive. So what you are suggesting in this situation, you look at the other parameters and you do a liver biopsy before you say that this ANA is of any value.
So of course, sir, we start with the abnormal LFT. If the LFT is normal and ANA is positive, he may have got it checked for some other reason. I would not care about it. I'll probably not even do the other investigation. So if the LFTs are abnormal, ANA is positive, I would do the other markers, a serum IgG levels, and then ask for a biopsy.
Can you clarify? You wanted to did not discuss that. Can you clarify on drug-induced autoimmune hepatitis in contrast to DILI mimicking as autoimmune hepatitis?
So sir, the distinction is on liver biopsy. So if you have a drug-induced liver injury, just withdrawing the drug should improve the liver function. But if the drug is acting as an epitope, if the drug is inducing autoimmunity and that autoimmunity may start within few weeks. Usually there's a big delay. I talked about molecular mimicry and epitope spreading. Usually there's a big delay. There's a delay of months to years between this. But sometimes you may have an inciting agent. It induces autoimmunity in a previously predisposed individual, and the biopsy may be classical of autoimmune hepatitis. That's where you label it as drug-induced autoimmune hepatitis. In a plain simple DILI, you just withdraw a drug, the LFTs should improve. In a drug-induced autoimmune hepatitis, even after the withdrawal of drug, the LFTs continue to be abnormal, and the biopsy shows autoimmune hepatitis.
How do you find in your experience the pathologists agreeing on the histopathology criteria, particularly interface hepatitis and the other criteria? Do you think that there is uniformity, or do you find there is subjective variation there as well?
It's absolutely subjective, sir. So I make it a point to see all liver biopsies which are done in our patients. So we have once a week pathology meeting, not once a week, once in 2 weeks pathology meeting, where we will discuss all important slides, whether liver biopsies or colonic biopsies. So our pathologists are tuned to diagnosing, but as I change hospital, I realize that the next pathologist does not do the same thing. So I would strongly suggest all residents also to make it a habit to discuss with their pathologists, because pathologists do need clinical input. They cannot make a diagnosis just on the basis of a biopsy slide. So you're right, sir, it is very subjective, but the clinicians need to standardize the diagnosis.
And in your experience, while talking about autoimmune hepatitis, transjugular versus percutaneous biopsy, this is just a practical inquisitiveness from my side, that in your experience, transjugular biopsies are as good as percutaneous biopsies, and now people are saying EUS biopsies.
So I have no experience with EUS biopsies, but our radiologist is excellent. The radiologist who does transjugular liver biopsies, he would usually take 3 or 4 passes. So if you have one pass, you'll generally get a small sample. But our radiologist will take 3 or 4 passes, and we get enough material. So transjugular biopsies, they may not be as thick as the conventional biopsy, but they give you adequate tissue.
So I think time to say thank you to you, Manav. It was an excellent deliberation. I think we chose the topic very aptly, both